So here's a question for you. Right now, in this moment, do you know where your body is? Literally. Can you feel your feet on the floor, your heartbeat? Do you know if you're hungry, or are you just assuming that you should eat because it's about that time? Do you know if you're tired, or are you running on a vague sense of something being off, but you're quietly ignoring that? Some of you may have just gotten very uncomfortable because you realized you have no idea. Some of you are like, of course I know. I can feel everything and it's overwhelming and I wish I couldn't. And some of you just went, that's a weird question. And then you kept listening, and I appreciate that. All three of those are responses to the same thing, interoception, the sense you were probably never taught that you had, and that explains more about how you function than almost anything else. So let's talk about it. I'm Elizabeth. I'm an ADHD clinician, coach, and neuroinclusive systems designer. This is Quirky Apes. My background spans a lot of science and a little bit of math, which all feeds my interest in how humans work, live, and function. So let's talk about our eighth sense. You were probably taught about the five senses in school: sight, hearing, smell, taste, and touch. Maybe you even got a bonus lesson on proprioception, which is the sense of your body in space, like knowing when your arm is raised, even if your eyes are closed. And if you were lucky, someone may have mentioned the vestibular sense, which is balance and movement through space. But interoception, almost nobody learns about interoception in school, and it may be the most important one. There is an ongoing debate about how many senses we have, and depending on who you ask, humans have anywhere from 6 to over 20 of them. Interoception, it consistently makes the list of the ones researchers consider the most fundamental, but it never made it into the elementary school curriculums. Interoception is your brain's ongoing sensory map of the inside of your body, the internal state of the organism you are living in right now. Your heart rate, breathing, temperature, the stretch and pressure of your gut, muscle tension, bladder fullness, pain, itching, nausea, hunger, the particular flavor of wrong that happens when your blood sugar drops and you haven't noticed. It's your body talking to your brain constantly on a channel that most of us were never really taught to tune very much into. The neuroscientist Antonio Damasio spent decades making the case that the body is the foundation of the self. The brain is embedded in a body that is sending it information every single second. And that information shapes your mood, your memory, your attention, and the decisions you think you're making with pure logic. Interoception is how that mechanism runs. It is the sensory system that carries the body's state into the brain's awareness continuously as the raw material for everything else. So let's get a little into the neuroscience, but try not to make it too boring. Your body has a massive network of sensory receptors embedded in almost every organ and tissue. These are dedicated internal sensors, distinct from the ones that track the external world. They detect mechanical stretch, like when your stomach fills up. They also detect chemical signals, like changes in your blood oxygen or your glucose. They detect temperature changes and inflammation. They also detect pain, and then they send that information up through a dedicated highway. That highway runs primarily through the vagus nerve, an extraordinary cranial nerve that wanders down from your brainstem through your neck into your chest and abdomen, carrying a two-way conversation between your brain and your body. About 80% of the fibers in the vagus nerve run upward from the body to the brain. Your brain is mostly listening. It receives far more than it sends. The body has much more influence over the brain than most people assume. And the brain's job is largely to make sense of what the body is already doing or experiencing. That information lands in the insular cortex or the insula. The insula is tucked inside of a fold in your brain, and it integrates all of the incoming body signal and does a first pass at asking, what does this mean? It is where the raw physical sensations start becoming something we can be aware of. Damage to the insula is associated with difficulty in recognizing thirst and difficulty in feeling the urge to breathe normally, and even profound disruptions to the emotional experience. The insula then connects your interior cingulate cortex, which handles your attention and emotional salience, and then onto your prefrontal cortex, which handles executive functioning and decision making, and deeper into the limbic structures involved in emotions and in memory. All of these regions are talking to each other all of the time, building a constantly updated model of what your body's state means for what you should do next. And as we've discussed in other episodes, neuroscientist Carl Friston theorized predictive processing. A quick recap, the core of the idea is that your brain is a prediction machine. It's constantly generating a model of what it expects to be true and comparing that model to the actual incoming signals, then updating if there is a mismatch. The brain runs a continuous simulation of its own body, and the incoming interoceptive signals are used to correct errors in that simulation. Much of what the brain is predicting all the time is the body state. What is my heart rate going to do? How full is my stomach? Am I hot or cold? Is this my energy level now? Interoception is the sensory side of that loop. It is the incoming signal that the brain uses to check its body predictions against reality. When there is a mismatch between what the brain predicted and what the body's actually reporting, the brain has to resolve it. Sometimes it updates the prediction. Sometimes it modifies the body's state to match the prediction. Sometimes, when the signal is unclear or unreliable, it keeps running the old prediction. That is where the downstream problems start to accumulate. When the interoceptive signal is clear and consistent, the brain's predictions stay close to reality and it updates efficiently, and it can generate responses that match what's actually happening. When the signal is noisy, muted, delayed, or overwhelming, the predictions drift. And when the body predictions drift, everything downstream is affected. Emotional regulation, attention, decision making, energy management, social behavior, even your sense of self, everything. So, what does interoception actually do for you? Interoception is how you know you're hungry. It might sound obvious to some of you, but some of you can probably imagine exactly how many people genuinely do not receive reliable signals on these. Many folks don't feel a clear, recognizable hunger signal until you've maybe gone so long without food that you're suddenly crashing or irritable or unable to focus and nauseated. And if you have no idea interoception is what's missing, you may have been told or told yourself that you're just bad at self-care. Interoception is also how you know you're tired. The actual felt sense of fatigue in your muscles and behind your eyes in your chest, they're distinct from the cultural version where you've been told it's time to sleep. A lot of people override this signal for so long and do so consistently, and then eventually they lose access to that signal. You may run on stimulants like caffeine and adrenaline and momentum, and then you might wonder why you crashed so hard. The signal stopped being audible over everything else. Interoception is a major driver of emotion. So, what we call emotions are partly body events that the brain interprets. When you notice your heart rate increasing and your chest tightening, and maybe your breathing changing, your brain has to decide what this means. Is it fear or excitement or anger? Is this the beginning of heart attack? The context shapes the interpretation, but the raw material is bodily sensation. Reduced interoceptive access means reduced accuracy in identifying what you are feeling emotionally. You feel something, but it arrives without a label or maybe with the wrong one. Interoceptive awareness is correlated with emotional granularity, which is the ability to distinguish between similar emotional states with precision. Not just whether something feels tolerable or overwhelming, but whether you're experiencing frustration versus disappointment, or excitement versus anxiety, or even grief versus exhaustion. And these distinctions really matter because they map onto very different responses. Treating anxiety like excitement leads somewhere very different than treating it like dread. The right label isn't just semantics. It can be the difference between a response that fits the situation and one that just compounds it. Interoception also shapes motivation and it shapes reward. When you are in a state of bodily need, whether that's hunger or fatigue or pain, your motivational system is shaped by that signal. Damasio's somatic marker hypothesis argues that bodily states act as markers that bias our decision making toward options that have historically resolved similar states. Your body has been tracking outcomes your whole life, associating certain choices with certain physical consequences. And those assumptions show up as felt inclinations before you've had time to think through consciously. Clear interoceptive access is how you read those signal markers. Without it, your decision making is working without some crucial information, and you may find yourself making choices that don't serve you and you don't really know why. And interoception is foundational to your sense of self. Anil Seth at the University of Sussex argues that the felt sense of being you, of having a continuous embodied self, is partly constructed from your ongoing interoceptive experience. You feel real in part because you feel your body continuously as a coherent physical presence in your world. The mechanism is literal. The brain uses interoceptive continuity as one of its anchors for the sense that there is a consistent self having these experiences. When that signal is disrupted, the sense of self can feel disrupted too. This is part of why depersonalization and derealization often involve disrupted interoception. Let's talk a little bit about interoception in occupational therapy, OT. Occupational therapy, which we call OT, is fundamentally concerned with how people participate in activities that make up their lives, which scopes interoception amazingly well. If you can't feel when you're tired, then you can't respond appropriately to fatigue. If you don't feel hunger, meal times become disconnected from your genuine need. And if you can't accurately read your levels of physical discomfort or arousal, then self-care and daily functioning require workarounds you probably didn't even know you were doing. Kelly Mailer is an occupational therapist who developed an interoception curriculum specifically designed to help people build awareness of and relationships with their body's signals. Her work emerged from practice with autistic and other neurodivergent people, and it's been applied far more broadly because the need is far more broadly distributed than clinical literature has historically acknowledged. Her central idea is that interoception is a prerequisite for emotional regulation. Before you can begin to regulate an emotion, you have to be able to notice that you are having one. Before you can notice you're having an emotion, you have to be able to feel the bodily state that generates it. With poor interoceptive access, the first signal that you might get something is wrong may be behavioral. You've already exploded or shut down or fled before you had any real conscious awareness that you were even escalating. This is a sensory processing difference. And the intervention is to build sensory access that makes it possible to notice in the first place. You can't regulate what you can't feel. Mailer's curriculum works from the ground up. It starts by building body awareness through structured, low stakes practice. What does running in place feel like? Where do you notice it? Can you describe it? What changes when you stop? This builds an experiential vocabulary. Over time, that vocabulary becomes available for even more complex internal states because the brain has practice attending to and labeling body signals when there's nothing writing on the answer. The OT framework also recognizes that interoception exists on a spectrum of accuracy and sensitivity. If you are interoceptively hypersensitive, you are receiving a strong, loud internal signal that may be overwhelming or distracting or difficult to regulate around. The fire alarm is going off all of the time, and it's going to be hard to do anything else. If you are on the other side, interoceptively hyposensitive, then you're receiving a muted or maybe even an absent signal and flying blind about your own internal state. Both affect function through different mechanisms. The same person can be hypersensitive in some domains and then be hyposensitive in others. Like you may have a very intense awareness of pain, but almost no awareness of hunger. Or you might feel every fluctuation in your heartbeat, but have almost no access to your fatigue signals. Interoception is a collection of different sensory streams, and those streams can have very different levels of clarity and intensity. A global assessment of someone's interoceptive profile misses most of what's happening. Interoception goes across nervous systems. Every nervous system has its own interoceptive signature. The research on autism and ADHD shows variation in how the systems work. The word deficit implies there's a right way to have interoception, and there really isn't. For autistic folks, the research has consistently found the differences in three distinct dimensions. Interoceptive accuracy, which is how closely your body reading matches what's actually happening. Interoceptive sensibility, which is how much you attend to and trust those internal signals. And interoceptive awareness, which is the alignment between your perceived accuracy and your actual accuracy. These three things don't always move together. Someone can have high sensibility, meaning they attend closely to the body signals, and still have low accuracy, meaning what they report doesn't reliably match external measures. Understanding which dimension is where the variation lives matters for what kind of support is actually useful. Some autistic people have a very high interoceptive sensibility, meaning they are intensely attending to body signals. But the signal itself may be intense, variable, or difficult to conceptualize. The volume is high, but the map for making sense of what the volume means is still being drawn. Others may have a lower sensibility, meaning they have learned, often through years of being told that their experience doesn't match what others expected, to suppress or to diminish their signal. Some of this suppression is learned. It's adaptive in environments that don't accommodate the way you process. Adaptive suppression does still have a cost. You can lose access to the information your nervous system was generating. For people with ADHD, different patterns can show up. Attention is regulated at the level of the nervous system, and interoception is itself an attentional process. The insula and the anterior cingulate cortex are your interoceptive processing hubs, and they're also involved heavily in attentional regulation. When attention is dysregulated, the ability to sustain focus on slow moving internal signals is affected too. You might miss hunger cues because you're hyper-focused on something that's interesting, or you might miss fatigue for the same reason, and then you crash. The signal was present, but the attentional resources to register it were elsewhere. Then there's a phenomenon called interoceptive disconnection, and that can show up in trauma responses. When the body becomes associated with threat, one adaptive strategy is to dampen the incoming signal, to become less aware of what the body is feeling because feeling it is dangerous. This is part of the neuroscience of dissociation, and it's important context for why people with trauma histories may have difficulty with interoception. The disconnection serves as a protective function. The work of reconnecting is slowly building a new relationship with a signal that previously meant danger. Every nervous system interacts with interoceptive processing in its own way, and understanding how yours works creates opportunity for support that actually addresses the mechanism rather than just the symptom. Now let's talk a little bit about alexithymia and the problem of not exactly having words. Alexithymia is closely connected to interoception, and it's wildly underrecognized. Alexithymia is a term that comes from the Greek, a meaning without, lexis meaning words, thymos meaning emotion. It describes a pattern in which people have difficulty identifying and describing their own emotional states. They have emotions, they just have limited access to those emotions as nameable and or describable things. And the research suggests that this already strongly correlates to interoception. From the inside, alexithymia can feel like a blankness where other people seem to have rich emotional experiences that you maybe don't feel like you can quite access. Or it might feel like a wall of undifferentiated something, a sense that you're experiencing something significant, but you can't quite pin down what it is. If you experience alexithymia, you might describe knowing intellectually that a situation should produce an emotional response while not being able to feel that response clearly. You may describe an emotional experience in physical terms instead, because the body signal may be available even when the emotional label isn't. The model that most researchers now work with is that emotion identification depends on reading body states. When the interoceptive signal is unclear or muted or difficult to interpret, the downstream process of naming and understanding your emotional state is also impaired. You feel something is wrong, but you can't quite say what it is. You know you're not fine, but you can't really locate why. You get asked how you feel, and you genuinely don't know because you don't have access to that information. Alexithymia is present in a significant portion of autistic people, and it is increasingly recognized as relevant in ADHD, trauma, and many other contexts. Research by Damian Milton, Rebecca Brewer, and others pulled apart which aspects of autistic experience are attributable to autism itself and which might be attributable to co-occurring alexithymia. Some things historically attributed to autism, like reduced emotional response or seeming emotionally flat, may be more specifically related to alexithymia. And that distinction matters clinically and personally because that support that helps with alexithymia may be different from the support designed around other aspects of the autistic experience. Alexithymia is often trainable. When people develop better interoceptive awareness, their emotional identification often improves. The words become more available because the underlying signal becomes clearer. The interoceptive signal and the language system to build new connections, and that takes repeated practice in contexts where stakes are low enough to pay attention. People who've spent decades without reliable emotional vocabulary really can to start to develop it. Now let's talk about predictive interoception and the body budget. Friston's predictive processing framework and Lisa Fieldman's Barrett's body budget concept come from different directions, but they land in the same place, which is a good reason to look a little further. Barrett uses the metaphor of a body budget to describe what the brain is doing with interoceptive information. She describes your body as constantly forecasting what resources your brain will need, allocating them in advance, and then adjusting based off of what actually happens. Heartbeats, breath, glucose, immune resources, all of that is being tracked and managed through a predictive loop. The brain is running the books. And like any budget, it can run a surplus or it can run a deficit. When the body budget is well managed and the predictions are all accurate, you feel reasonably well. When the predictions are systematically off, when the brain is consistently over or underestimating what it needs, you can feel off in ways that are hard to localize. You're not sick exactly. You're not in pain exactly, but something feels wrong. You're tired, but you can't sleep. Maybe you're flat or you're dysregulated and you don't know why. That may be a budget deficit from the inside. Barrett argues that affect, the basic felt sense of valiance and arousal that underlies all more specific emotions, is partly a readout of the body budget. Are things roughly balanced? Are you running a deficit? Is your brain predicting an incoming demand that it doesn't have all the resources for? All of that can shape a felt sense that colors everything about your experience. When the budget is stressed, threat feels more likely, effort feels more costly, and the world narrows. When the budget is solvent, the same situations can read very differently. This is why sleep, food, movement, and social connection have such measurable effects on mental health. They are primary inputs that keep the body budget solvent. When any of those inputs is chronically disrupted or depleted, the interoceptive signal that the brain is working with is now degraded and the predictions drift. And again, everything downstream reflects that. You can't think your way or feel your way or regulate your way out of a depleted body budget. You have to actually replenish it. And it also explains something a lot of people in neuroinclusive communities have known empirically for years. Regulation is a lot easier when the basics are covered. This is just budget math. So how does interoception develop and what happens when it doesn't? Interoception develops over time, and that development depends on both biological and experiences in your early childhood. The body signals are there in early childhood, but the capacity to interpret them and attach meaning and language to them develops through interaction. When a caregiver is consistently and accurately responding to a child's body states, helping to name them, validate them, and helping that child to learn to associate internal signals with meaning, that becomes scaffolding the child's interoceptive development needs. This is something called co-regulation. It is teaching the nervous system to make sense of itself. The child learns it through having their internal states reflected back to them somewhat accurately by someone who can help read them. When this scaffolding is absent or inconsistent or misattuned, the child's interoceptive development can be disrupted. The signal that's there, but there's no map for making sense of it. So sometimes the child learns that the signal is unreliable because their caregiver's response didn't match their actual states. A child may also learn to suppress that signal because expressing their internal state led to unpredictable or punishing outcomes. In each case, the child's relationship with their own interoceptive experience is shaped by what happens when they try to communicate it. Caregivers, though, can only scaffold what they themselves have. A caregiver who is maybe alexithymic or who they themselves is operating from a poorly mapped interoceptive system can't accurately mirror what they can't feel. And this is how interoceptive difficulty transmits across generations through the relational scaffolding that either builds or fails to build the map, not through genetics alone. It's important to understand this as a mechanism rather than a moral failure in some circumstances. For children whose nervous systems process interoception differently, which may include many autistic and ADHD children, there could be an additional layer. Their signals may not match the cues that their caregivers have been taught to read. They may have very intense signals in some domains and nearly absent signals in others. While a caregiver who doesn't know this, they may consistently misread or correct the child's self-reports, inadvertently teaching that child that their body signal is wrong. That is a very hard thing to unlearn, especially when it happens early and consistently and from people you depend on. But interoception is plastic. The brain continues to learn and to read the body more accurately throughout your lifetime. It is slower work in adulthood than it is in childhood, as most developmental things are, but the capacity doesn't close. People rebuild interoceptive access after trauma. People develop emotional vocabulary in their 40s that they never had in their 20s. The window is long, and the nervous system is responsive to experience for much longer than we used to think. So let's get into a little bit of the practical stuff. Where does any of this actually land in real life? Because education that doesn't go somewhere actionable is just trivia. And no hate to trivia. Love me some trivia. But I also love it when it's pretty applicable. Building interoceptive awareness requires returning attention to the body repeatedly in ordinary moments over time. In moments when you have a little space. What does this feel like? Where do I notice it? Can I describe it without immediately judging it? The goal early on is not accuracy, it's contact. Just staying long enough in the relationship with the signal to begin to build a map for it. Body scanning practices, which come out of mindfulness traditions and have been adapted in clinical settings, can work by systematically directing attention through different regions of the body with the goal of noticing rather than changing. Mailer's OT framework offers structured activities for people who find that open attention is too much in their body and it's too fast. It starts with movement, with proprioceptive input, with things that are clear and grounded in body signals, and builds a foundation that makes more subtle internal awareness possible later. You earn the quieter signals by practicing with the louder ones first. And if you're a clinician or a coach, shifting your client's regulation work toward an interoceptive frame often changes what's accessible to them. The question is, what are you noticing in your body right now, rather than how do you feel? Which for many people with alexithymia or interoceptive differences is an unanswerable question and can produce shame. So slow down, make space, and don't automatically interpret for them. Let them practice finding the signal and describe what you observe from the outside if they give you permission. You can offer that as information. For instance, you might say, I notice your breathing has changed. What do you notice? For people with ADHD specifically, external reminders, body check-ins, and building signals into routines can help compensate for attentional inconsistency. The attentional system is demand sensitive. It needs the body signal to be brought into competition with whatever else is claiming its attention. And external scaffolding is built to do just that. An alarm clock that says, check in with your body, makes a real signal audible again. And for anyone that finds the body feels like a foreign country to you, maybe who feels more comfortable in their head than their skin, or who's spent years of effortful performance of being fine while internally the signal was chaos or silence, you developed adaptations that made a sense given to your nervous system of what it was working with. Adaptation is protective and it has a cost. Those adaptations were built for one environment and they tend to need recalibration when the environment changes. And sometimes the most useful thing you can do is to go back and build the foundation you didn't get to build at the time. You now have more resources. You can do more with the context and you know more about your nervous system. It's not starting over. It's picking up a thread that was always yours. Thanks for joining me on this episode. If you or your organization could use an LPC coach or consultant, or you need some training from someone who thinks like this, I am available. And if you want some free resources or to learn more about neurocontextual systems design or therapy, visit creativesolutionscoaching.com or find me on the socials.